Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar work on data. We'll just give a couple more minutes for people to shuffle in, and then we'll start shortly. I see people are still shuffling in. So maybe just one more minute, and then we'll kick it off. And just so everybody knows, this meeting is being recorded and transcribed automatically. So by joining the meeting, you agree to both of these things. All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. For those who are familiar with us, this is the Materials Hub of the Global ABC. This meeting is open to people inside and outside the hub, so you may have seen us. You may be a member of the club, but Materials Hub, but you could also be somebody joining us from outside today. So we're trying to put in a little bit of background and introduction before we hand over to our colleague Anil from RIX to lead us on the webinar promoting a data ecosystem. So, all right. I'm speaking to you today from UNEP, which hosts the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. We have about 300 some members already from multiple countries, but also from everybody along the um, value chain. So from the private sector, public sector, research and think tanks, civil society, etc. The Global ABC acts around four axes. Number one is advocacy to action. Number two is on tracking progress and setting targets. And then, of course, we work closely with governments, both at national and subnational level, to set priorities and measures. And then finally, we also work with the private sector. Around their priorities and strategies on how to build a decarbonized sector. And overall, the vision of the global ABC is to lead to a zero emissions, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. So, we work also as part of the Materials Hub, which is a collaboration effort between the Global ABC, the Life Cycle Initiative, and the One Planet Network, all of whom are hosted by UNEP and the Costa Rica Green Buildings Council. And the reason we focus on the building materials particularly is because we already know that, sorry, one second. All right. So we all know that material buildings contributes about a third of the emissions globally. But to add to that, about 10% of these emissions come from um, building materials. And that's why we're trying to focus more on that. And of course, we are expecting a lot of construction to happen, as only 50% of the buildings that are going to be there in 2060 are standing today, which means that today, right now, we have the opportunity to make quite a lot of change. All right. And so we advocate for a framework to reduce embodied carbon that depends on three things. First, it's the avoid, shift, improve framework. First, we can avoid building whenever we can, and to build with less, so less materials. And we really think about the buildings that we already have, what's their use, and how we can make the best use of them. And then from there, we use life cycle analyses and other approaches to, such as circular approaches, to encourage this building with less and building less. Then we also encourage people to shift, on the industry to shift towards alternative building materials. And that includes developing and encouraging these local supply chains, identifying certifications and standardizing the use of alternative building materials, etc. And then finally, we look also at improving and decarbonizing conventional building materials. So today you're going to hear about data, which is a question that underlines these three um, legs of this tool to this framework, because we can't avoid if we don't know, if we can't do these analysis, we don't really know what we're avoiding. And if we're shifting to alternative building materials, we need to understand what their impacts are and how they compare to conventional building materials that we use. So data really is at the heart of a lot of the work that we do. And so I'm glad that today we have the team from RICS and other colleagues to take us through. But to wrap up on the materials hub side, our mission really is to work in knowledge generation, dissemination, and implementation, really to facilitate this application of the avoid, shift, improve framework. And as we do that, of course, we're also looking at is we are definitely motivated from an environmental standpoint, but we do not forget also the humans that are at the center of the work that we do. So environmental considerations along with socioeconomic considerations are really at the heart of the work that we do. And very similar to the role of the Global ABC, as we are a hub under the Global ABC, we do quite a lot of the same work. We work around identifying one mission, advocating, creating tools and solutions that link with SDGs, and finally building education materials and best practices exchange within the network. This working group has, this hub has three working groups, one focused on circular built environment, one focused on whole life cycle policy coalitions, and one focused on bio-based materials. And here you can see the co-leads of these three different working groups who are pushing forward different activities. And so if you're interested in joining the Materials Hub, this is a QR code to join the Hub. We opened this webinar to people outside the Hub, so feel free to join us. And then in terms of ongoing activities, one thing we've been working hard on advertising has been this webinar. And I kept it in this slide because there's also one later today at 5 o'clock Central European time. So if you like it and you would like to invite other people to this webinar, it is not too late. There is another session later today. At the same time, we're also working on two main products. Um, we're also working on two more products. Number one is the compendium on bio-based materials, and this is a compendium where we're collecting resources from different actors, both members of GlobalABC and outside of GlobalABC, who are sharing with us their experiences in building with alternative materials. So please feel free to send us your submissions, as we hope to have a proof of concept ready to be launched during the COP this year. And then on the other side, you'll see that we have the 10 whole life cycle recommendations for the buildings breakthrough. And these recommendations highlight everything from finance, data, policy, circularity in building. And so if you've had any experiences with this, please feel free to share some of your examples with us. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand over to Anna, so he can take us through the presentation and the webinar today. We're very lucky to have quite an esteemed panel with us. So thank you so much for your time, and I really am excited to hear everything that you have to say today.
Thank you so much, Mona. I really appreciate this opportunity for all of us to come and have a discussion on this very important topic. I liked the three-legged framework that you shared, but I think it's very clear that data sort of underpins those three legs of the framework that you shared, as well as I think any measurements we do in regards to near zero emissions and resilient buildings, we probably would require data to support that. So in order for me to set the stage, I know we have an excellent panel today for sharing their thoughts on the topic, but I wanted to set the stage by giving you some context about this webinar. But before I do that, I'd also like to quickly introduce you to our panel members. So our panel members are Tina Paye, who's the RICS president, as well as has her own initiative called Circuit Trade and is a global leader in the broad area of sustainability, and has really shared her leadership and vision with RICS members during her presidency. We then have Martin Rock, who represents the GBDI initiative. He's well published. I follow him extensively on LinkedIn and wherever he publishes more about whole life carbon and really the data and the technical details that sit behind our assessments. And then we have Nigel Tonks, who's part of the ARUP team. He's also a global leader, is really supportive of our RICS activities, has helped us move the needle in terms of whole life carbon assessment. So you'll be hearing from the three of them once I help understand why this webinar. So I hope all of you can see my screen in the slideshow mode. So the title really is Promoting a Data Ecosystem for Near Zero Emission and Resilient Built Environment. Once again, my name is Anil Sahani. I am Head of Sustainability for RICS, as well as the Chair of the ICMS Standard Setting Committee. So a bit of a background, we feel that a data ecosystem is extremely important for meeting the goal of near zero emissions and resilient buildings. But really, as was seen during the Buildings and Climate Global Forum in March of 2024, there is a challenge that our sector faces due to the lack of open shared data ecosystem, and that actually hinders accurate whole life carbon assessments, which are then linked to our mission of near zero emissions and resilient buildings. So the underpinning of these assessments is crucial, thereby making the importance of data even more so for our efforts. There is a limited availability of locally relevant secondary data, which is a significant barrier to using WLCA, especially in some regions, emerging markets, and countries. Um, there are several global and regional initiatives that are in play right now to bridge this gap, promote interoperability and data sharing. Lastly, we have various initiatives that are also being coordinated to support the vision and mission of GlobalABC's Material Hub. So in terms of the objectives today, what we want to do is highlight the importance of data in achieving our mission, talk a little bit about primary and secondary data for whole life carbon assessments and also resilient buildings, and then look at various strategies which are available for providing good quality secondary data and share best practices for consistently measuring and estimating primary data. So we want to discuss current challenges, promote industry-wide collaboration on this issue of data, and highlight the importance of sharing the results of our assessments, which I think Nigel and will also share from an industry perspective why it is important for us to have benchmarks and how data and the assessment results play a role there. You will hear from Martin about the global initiative on data standards and schemas that help bring consistency, accuracy, and interoperability to our assessments. So to level set, when we say data for near zero emission buildings, which connects to resilient buildings as well, I see the data in three buckets. As you can see on my slide, the primary data, secondary data, and then limits and budgets. Primary data is all the data that is directly linked to the project or the asset under consideration. So if you're running an assessment for an existing building, for example, or for a new bridge, all data that is directly estimated from the project or asset is the primary data. Here, we can only provide best practices and guidelines. Perhaps quantity surveyors, RICS members may be involved. So as a global initiative, we can help provide how to best measure, perhaps how to use building information models to derive your estimates, how to use energy models to get primary data about energy and water use in your building. We recommend use of model-based approach, so BIM or otherwise. Secondary data is the background data that helps run the assessment. It's generally provided at the national level. A core piece of that is the strengthening of product category rules and EPDs. Beyond that, I see data as limits and budgets or benchmarks, which generally are created using a top-down sectoral approach and a bottom-up project level or asset level approach. A very good example, which RICS is so delighted to be part of, is the recently released, in fact, a week ago released UK net zero carbon building standard, which sets those limits and budgets, benchmarks, performance levels for various building typologies. Obviously, this work needs to also extend to the infrastructure assets. So what is then hindering us from moving ahead? And one of our marquee reports every year, the sustainability report of RICS, which is going to be launched this year's version in November ahead of COP29. The first blocker that are respondents, and generally we get anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 global respondents, they generally rank lack of established standards, tools, databases, and benchmarks and guidance as the key blocker towards a whole life carbon assessment, especially using the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard second edition. So keep in mind, data plays therefore a very crucial role. Our standard also helps lay out the requirements of data at various life cycle stages. We see a lot of similarity between the cost and carbon. Therefore, I think there should be an integrated cost and carbon approach when it comes to data. So as the project or the asset evolution takes place over the life cycle stages, different types of data is needed, and the accuracy level, information availability, and the ability of project team to influence on cost and carbon also changes. So this is sort of a summary of what do you really need. So initially you would need perhaps asset level benchmarks. So that comes from the third bucket that I shared. And then asset and sub-asset level benchmarks again from that bucket. But as you progress, you move towards estimated quantities, energy models. And then when we have construction or practical completion, you move towards as-built quantities and metered data. So that's how the data progression takes place. There is already a globally accepted high-level framework that the ISO provides for the core secondary data that we need, that is EPDs. There's already ISO 23386 that provides data dictionaries for interconnected data dictionaries and governance. So if you were to look at EPDs, already a global framework exists. For example, the ISO 22057, which is a data template for EPDs for building information modeling framework, which rests on the ISO 19650 series of standards. There's also the 23387, which is the data template for construction objects, and that's very similar to the digital passports and so on. So I think an interoperable data standard and governance model exists. It's a matter of taking these initiatives into practice, and I think a lot of great work is now happening both at RICS and other stakeholders and initiatives also. So as RICS, we are building the built environment carbon database, which essentially provides you with those product level and asset level libraries, which essentially means EPDs, LCAs that may be required as an input for assessments. And we are also using BECD for reporting back your results. So sort of if you can see, it's the second bucket and the third bucket, which is supported through BECD. More information about BECD is available on our website as well. So with that, I think I've shared with you the broad brush context of this webinar. With that, I think I'm going to stop sharing first, go back to my screen where I can see you. The next thing we want to do is hear opening statements from our experts. I have randomly, for some reason, selected or requested Tina to go first, and then Martin, and then Nigel. I'm going to be sharing Tina's presentation, and I think Martin and Nigel will be running their own presentation. So give me a minute as I fire that up. Tina, the mic is yours. Maybe you can begin by giving a bit more background while I get the presentation shared.
First, I have to turn my mic on. Sorry. Rookie error. Thank you so much, Anil, for the introduction and that more than overview. I think it was quite in depth. You covered a lot of ground with your introduction. And I'd just like to say thanks also to GlobalABC for inviting me to this really critical discussion. I'm really excited to join the panel because last week I was in New York City for Climate Week, and yesterday evening I was launching an initiative called the Circular Dew Tank at RICS headquarters, and that's all about really boosting the circular economy and reuse of materials. So it seems really fitting, everything we were hearing earlier from Mona on the Materials Hub, that after listening in New York to comments about the New York City circular construction guide, which is getting into place, which is really new and quite pushing the idea of reuse, and then to hear about also yesterday evening to be launching the circular dew tank, to be part of the Materials Hub GlobalABC today session. Is it all sort of fits hand in hand. So I think if we go back to maybe the next slide, if we go back to RICS and our journey in sustainability, I think we can say that RICS has been for a very long time one of the leaders of the sustainability conversation. And we first put out our initial professional standard on whole life carbon assessments in 2017. So that was probably a time when most of us professionally weren't even talking about carbon, perhaps a little bit about operational carbon. Even less people were aware of the issue of the embodied carbon conundrum, as I like to call it. We came out with that first standard. And in 2023, we marked the release of our second edition. A lot of things changed in this world between 2017 and 2023. And so the update was meant not only to bring our whole life carbon assessment standard up to speed with where the market was sitting, but also to ensure that it could be globally rolled out and that it could be harmonized across different geographies and regions. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important a little bit later. So we also participated in COP28 and have been supporting Buildings Breakthrough, which, as most of you know, was at the time of COP28, 29 different countries, a very large swath of the economy that signed up to make buildings near zero and climate resilient by 2030. So that's a huge step to take. And then we were also part of a follow-up meeting on the topic, which was the Buildings and Climate Global Forum in March 2024 in Paris. And there, 70 countries signed up to the Declaration of Chaillot, which likewise has some very ambitious targets to meet, an ambitious setup and organization in order to bring near zero and climate resilient buildings to the forefront in our countries that signed. So I think the year of 2024 has really highlighted the importance of environmental data for meeting the goal of net zero emissions and resilient buildings. And that was really evident last week in New York Climate Week, where there was really meaningful dialogue with global leaders and international stakeholders. We could go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Anil. So RICS sustainability strategy focuses on the natural and built environment. And there are 4 themes and 4 levers which underpin these themes. As you can see, decarbonization, biodiversity, circularity, and resilience. And clearly, in decarbonization, it's about standardizing the metrics for measurement so that we can measure and improve, but so that we can also compare and benchmark. In biodiversity, it's about influencing decision makers. In circularity, we're providing guidance, training, support, and really building the business case around circularity by working with a number of, we like to call them doers in the circular dew tank, or pledgers, those that are actually undertaking reuse of materials in their development and refurbishment projects and supporting them to build that forward. And then finally, resilience, which levers, obviously, leveraging data and technology. But I think it's safe to say that data is really the golden thread that connects all of these themes and levers in sustainability. We could go to the next slide, please. So, what is a data-driven decarbonization ecosystem? I think, RICS supports the whole life carbon assessment and decarbonization ecosystem by providing standards and practice information on how to measure whole life carbon. And that really goes the full circle, as you can see here on the slide, on how do you measure whole life carbon. Well, there's a few main data points that really need to be, underlined. And they seem simple, but this is really the pillars of actually a data-driven decarbonization ecosystem. And I think I'm not going to talk much longer. We have our ICMS third edition, which also actually includes both the data of cost and carbon side by side. And as Anil was saying in the introduction, that's key. We need at each design phase, at each preparation of a project, at each execution phase, to be ensuring that the cost and the carbon are working hand in hand and that they are actually efficiently producing a net zero building, for instance. And we also have another point that Anil touched on, which is our built environment carbon database, which is collecting carbon information at both an asset level, whether that be a building or infrastructure project, and then at individual component level, whether that be through the EPCs or other documents at component level. So I think I'm going to probably stop there and let the others give their views. But invite you, if you want, to click on the QR code and visit our Whole Life Carbon Assessment Hub. You'll find a number of resources there that I think could be very useful. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tina. I'm going to now request Martin to share his screen. And is Martin there? Yes, he is.
Yes, I'm there.
Martin, we can't hear you. Maybe you're, yeah, right there. Okay.
Yes, you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Yes, and you should also see my screen. So thank you very much, Anil. Thanks, Tina. I'm already and Mona for the words so far. I think that already creates a great context for also our work in context of this open data ecosystem. I'm here on behalf of the Global Building Data Initiative. That's an initiative that we launched earlier this year and that we also went public with at the Paris Global Forum. My name is Martin Röck, and I'm heading our research and development activities. I'm just quickly going over the facts that we already heard in part. We'd all discussed that there is around 40% of global emissions arising from building construction and operation. But what is also important to understand that for our new buildings, and many are still to be newly constructed, we have 50 or even up to 90% of the emissions actually arising due to material production and processing. So that is the fact for energy efficient buildings who are increasingly energy efficient and reducing the emissions from building operation. And there we can have around 40 tons of CO2 per 100 square meters of newly constructed building emitted upfront. So that is before the building is even in use. And out of that, up to 2/3 are in the building structure. That also informs the focus of the GBDI. What is also important to understand is that out of the new construction that we will see by 2050, around 90% are projected to happen in Global South regions, where there is a valid case for new construction in those regions, just because it's needed to ensure well-being in the safe and just future. So it's really also a different perspective where Global North countries should focus on existing building stocks, on improving existing building stocks and reducing new construction activity as much as possible, while at the same time we have a valid case for new construction in Global South regions. And we really need collaboration and aligned action to still be able to move forward with the global decarbonization agenda. And to do that also in an equitable way, it's important to have a global representation and diversity of voices in the debate as we progress with climate action. Now linking this to data, we know that already today up to 3/4 of emissions could be reduced of the material-related emissions with the technologies that we have today. There are a number of strategies Mona already indicated. Some are related to avoiding materials and for example, doing better structural design. Others are related to shifting to alternative materials or improving existing conventional materials such as concrete and steel. For all of those, it's really crucial to better understand buildings, and we really need better data to inform better designs and then enable better buildings. And that's where the mission of the Global Building Data Initiative, the GBDI, comes in. Our approach is to leverage open data to inform industry and policy action for reducing both really the resource use, so that's the really strong avoid perspective, also optimizing resource use in new buildings, and thereby also reducing upfront embodied carbon and whole life carbon emissions of new buildings. And we do that through three main activities. One is related to establishing a global network of key actors, really also focusing on involving and developing Global South partnerships. The second one is to work with our partners on coordinated, open and scalable data protocols for aligned reporting. Whatever assessment methods different parties may use, we want to align on how we report the results, how we report the methods, also the inventories going into those assessments, as Anil already explained. And the third working stream at this point is that we're working on an open source technical infrastructure to support global data collection and analysis going forward. And I've brought with me a quick overview of the activities and our progress at this point. We're really moving forward on developing a global network of partners, working with leading industry experts around both product data as well as building level data. Our own focus is really on the building level data, and we really emphasize the importance of primary building data because we believe it's crucial to really understand what is driving the emissions behind building design. It's not just important to understand the results of your whole life carbon assessment, but we really want to understand the resource use and the detailed bill of quantities that is going into a building in order to inform benchmarking, in order to inform target compliance, and to really enable a hotspot analysis that can improve and optimize the design. And we've been fortunate to work with our partners over the past few months on the open building data format, which we will launch also later this year. Then a third thing, as I already said, is a global building database hub, which we are currently developing to support data management, but also visualization, dashboards, benchmarking of materials, and other forms of lifecycle analytics. This platform will be public access and will have an open API so that also third parties can connect to it and also build applications on top of it. And we're currently in the process of also developing the next phases of the GBDI together with our partners in different domains, corporate, government, and also finance sectors, and really developing the global partnerships. Now I want to quickly give you a view that is just a high-level perspective on kind of the network of experts that is also informing and contributing to the work of the GBDI. I already mentioned the open building data format. That is a protocol that is intended to be easy to apply globally. It's really around harmonizing with existing schemas, so not duplicating and not introducing a new thing, but rather being able to build on the work that has been done already by our colleagues at RICS, by the colleagues, for example, also in North America, doing the ECHO project, where they worked on really aligning the building attributes that should be included in a harmonized reporting. We're also taking that up. And we're providing a data structure, a scalable data structure that builds on this existing knowledge and experience in the industry and also the best practice that we have from the research domain. And we will come forward with technical guidelines, with upload templates, and also with the detailed data structure that can be implemented in different tools. And there are really interesting discussions going on behind the scenes around that at the moment. Also, the Open Building Database Hub is moving forward. Here again, I want to emphasize our focus being on structure and on material quantities and material specifications, really to understand what is driving the emissions of the buildings and also how to improve them. but both the open building data format as well as the open building database hub have a whole building and a whole life cycle scope. And we already have a prototype in place. It's not yet publicly available, but we're testing it with our partners, and we're already excited to launch it probably early next year to the public. And if all of that sounds interesting to you, I invite you to join the Global Initiative. There are different ways to get involved. You can find more information also through the QR code. I also invite you to get in touch with me directly if you're interested to partner with us. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion today with the leading experts in this space. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. That was an excellent overview of all the initiatives and the importance of an open data standard data model that underpins all the activities you're doing. I think, Tina, you really provided a very broad cross-cutting view of taking a longer-term view of the importance of data on all aspects of sustainability. So thank you. Nigel, with no pressure, the last word is yours.
Okay, let's see if I can. Okay. Am I sharing that okay? Great. Very good. Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. And thanks, Anil, and thanks to GlobalABC. My name is Nigel Tonks. I suppose I come at this from two perspectives. One is a practitioner, as a director of Arup. I'm a consulting engineer, and I advise clients on decarbonisation of new and refurbished buildings, but also as a senior advisor to the Climate Champions. I'm delighted to support the work, the amazing work of GlobalABC in bringing, collaborative efforts together to advance decarbonisation in the built environment. So with those two perspectives, my interest in the data ecosystem, I suppose, began where in 2021, Tina's already said that so much has changed between 2017 and 2023, but in 2021 was the point where my board agreed with some persuasion to publicly commit to assessing whole life carbon on all our buildings globally. We'd been exploring whole life carbon and embodied carbon impacts for nearly 20 years, pioneering work with the UK Building Carbon Roadmap and PAS 2080 Carbon Management Guidance. But the reality was in 2021 that across Arup, our carbon work was sporadic. None of the 90 locations around the world mandated whole life carbon assessments by policy or regulation. And I estimate that probably 1 in 10 of our buildings that we were designing undertook whole life carbon assessments of any description. Out of a portfolio of 1,000 projects, that's perhaps 900 projects that were not. So, where we were assessing carbon, teams were using locally improvised approaches. These might have varied from simple rough and ready calculations or calculations cobbled together on quite in-depth spreadsheets, all the way through to finely detailed assessments carefully following the RICS assessment methodology that Anil has pointed us to. Some of our teams would focus on elements of a building, perhaps looking at the superstructure only, while other teams would be attempting fuller carbon offtakes, which might include the facade, the building services, and architectural finishes. We identified that at the time of this commitment, our firm was using more than 150 different tools and techniques to assess the operational embodied carbon where we were doing so. And a lot of these things were developed, in-house, because this was emerging methodology. And nowhere was any of this data being stored in a way that it was possible for us to make an evaluation either of the benefit that we were bringing through design through avoided emissions, or the total sum of emissions from our products, or even simply to be able to make clear side-by-side comparisons between different solutions. So we took inspiration from Peter Drucker on the back. You can't measure it you can't improve it, and hence our commitment. So over the next 3 years, if I can move my slides on, I don't seem to, how do I? There we go, just forgive me. Over the next 3 years, we invested in building an international data and digital platform in an attempt to harmonize how we make assessments and how we capture that data. This diagram attempts to just capture that in some simple things. We needed a common reference library of primary carbon data, carbon factors, grid energy intensities, alongside our project information. We needed a common approach to actually performing the LCA methodology, the LCA calculation, and the RICS assessment methodology provides very clear guidelines in that sense. And then we needed a structured database, a structured repository that would enable us to gather those emissions and store that secondary data in a logical and comparable way. And all of that is a fairly complex data storage system. So to be able to extract data from that, you need to build a user interface that allows you to go and then scrutinize that data to be able to extract the insights from it. So all of this, you know, there was some complexity and some unfamiliar terms in this. So we also had to build quite substantial structured learning programs to expand that life cycle assessment capability beyond the pioneering sustainability decarbonization assessors and experts into the wider engineering membership. And this is really important because this is where it needs to be. It's not just expert auditors that can help us assess our work and give us a dashboard on how we're doing. We need our designers to be able to think with carbon as much as cost and safety to be able to make the proposals to improve the design. And then this is an example of that data storage that I was talking about, setting up a data schema of how we capture the data so that when we input carbon data on projects and then we go to make comparisons between projects, we're able to get to a level of granularity where we can compare one project with another project. So we've managed to raise participation now up to about 80% of our projects over the last 3 years since making the commitment. So we still have a way to go to meet our aspiration to be carrying out detailed whole life carbon assessments on all our projects, but we're making progress and it's going to be a multi-year transformation plan. We gathered data globally, so these are data points that were collected from our projects. We've also shared the project data with the Built Environment Carbon Database that Anil mentioned, which is a UK-based repository for whole life carbon. It gathers project assessment data as well as EPD and product lifecycle assessments data. And some of this data was used to populate the net zero, the UK net zero standard, which Anil mentioned, which was launched last week, which has benchmark targets for embodied carbon in various building typologies where data like this existed. There, you know, this is across nearly 10 different typologies, but some of our data is richer in certain building typologies like education and commercial offices, more so than perhaps in, say, sport or retail. And, you know, we're sharing the insights that we're getting through this through collaborations with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So the things that we're learning, we're putting out in white papers to try and share with the industry, to try and help promote knowledge and awareness. We've produced papers on embodied carbon and operational carbon with them. And such was the interest in this approach and methodology. I mean, lots of people are doing carbon calculations. I'm not I'm not pretending for one moment that we're unique in that sense, but it does seem that trying to gather the data in this way and standardize across our international business did cause a lot of interest. And so we published this case study this year, sharing all of that information, how we put the schema together, the lessons that we're learning, the challenges that we're trying to overcome, the progress that we've made, and where we want to go next. And you can access that document from this QR code. So just to sum up, I think to support the argument that's being made in this panel, we absolutely support the view that the first critical step to reducing carbon is to do the carbon assessment. I know that's a very simple thing to say, but such a vast majority of our industry is still not. So do the carbon assessments. Policy and regulation is changing incredibly fast, with the EPBD in Europe bringing forward a requirement to measure life cycle carbon by 2027. So I think our industry just needs to get on this. Store the data, so it's really important to be able to gather that data in a structured way so that you can then access that data and get insights from it. Share the data so that others can draw insights from it and help themselves to be able to make good recommendations to clients. And the last step is in harmonizing the data and our approach. And we've got a long way to go there. There's a lot of complexity here in how we improve the completeness, the accuracy, and the comparability of this data. I think I'll leave it there. Stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I think those were some excellent presentations, and I'm already seeing a lot of discussion and questions raised in the chat. I guess we will address those as we move forward. I'm already seeing folks interacting with each other as well, which is excellent. That is the real purpose of running this webinar. So before we go into the questions being posed by participants, I did have a few questions. These would help drive the discussion a little bit deeper as well. So the first question, and these are very broad-based questions, we can take them in the direction based on the response from our experts. So the first question I want to pose to the panel is, what are the critical gaps in the current data ecosystem that hinder accurate whole life carbon assessments? And then how can we address these gaps collaboratively? To a large extent, your presentations did touch on these. So I think given the question, I would ask Martin to get us started, and then Nigel, if you can also chip in, we will then move on to the next question.
Thank you, Anil. So what are the critical gaps in the current data ecosystem to hinder accurate whole life carbon assessment, and how to address that? So my own perspective is from a researcher who's been working for several years at the science to policy interface. So personally, I'm convinced, and we've had great progress in working with policymakers to inform what they can do to drive down whole life carbon emissions through regulation. And I think that's one important point. I think it's important to create demand for those kind of assessments, for whole life carbon assessments. And a very, very effective way for creating that demand is through regulation. By policymakers to regulate, to request industry to conduct whole life carbon assessments and report that. I think it's also a great way to actually support the industry in developing the capacity that they need to conduct those assessments. And I believe in the past we've seen that there are some frontrunners also in the industry who have already done that, even though it was not requested. They've built capacity, and Nigel just spoke in a very impressive way on the journey and the experience that Arup could gather over the years. But many out there are not yet doing whole life carbon assessments, and therefore they also lack the experience to do it. And there, I think we then risk to end up in a loop where the industry remains cautious because they lack experience. They don't know how to do the assessments. And somehow at the same time, there is also a lack of clear guidance. At least that's what we also see in the European context. Even though we are moving forward with reporting requirements, also with targets having to be determined by 2027 and 2030 respectively, we still see that there is a certain caution also on the policymaker side to make really prescriptive requirements as to what whole life carbon assessments and reporting needs to look like. And there, I think it's really a dynamic where both industry needs to improve their capacity and policymakers need to give more clear guidance to really have more accurate whole life carbon assessments and be able to address the gaps collaboratively.
Thanks, Martin. Nigel, if you could add to that.
Well, I think there are challenges at every step of the ecosystem, but let me just try and focus on a couple. Or, in building an assessment, you obviously need an accurate assessment of the bill of materials that goes into a building. Perhaps we'll come back to that later on, I think. But the other factor in that is what the primary carbon emissions or embodied carbon factors are, basically environmental product declarations for products to factor those things. And we have some gaps. We have big gaps in our knowledge around embodied carbon factors on a regional basis. There are many open source databases, too many to mention, coming together, but engineers still need to make decisions around which values are most relevant. And this is, and they need to keep up to date with the changes. And all of this is quite time consuming to curate these things, but it's really important. In an organization like ours, we might have various teams supporting different aspects of a project with the same client. And if those teams are using different carbon factors from different databases, then the analysis for the client will be different. And that is a perceived inaccuracy, even though with best practice and best intentions, those teams might have been searching through to try and get the best possible product carbon factor for that material. So that's an area, but there are, and the regional challenge is very great. A couple of years ago, we did a survey in African practices, and we found that there was one registered EPD in sub-Saharan Africa, which just points to the gap in data. But there are activities underway. So we're working with IFC World Bank in collaboration with the Open Data Climate Initiative and Building Transparency to develop sets of generic carbon data to support, and particularly to support the EDGE certification process to fill those gaps. So calculating from best available knowledge in a region from the EPDs that do exist, and then trying to translate those on a regional basis to try and create a suite of carbon factor data to try and fill some of those gaps. And then the last thing I'd point to is in the UK net zero standard that we work very closely with RICS and the other initiatives that collaborated on the UK net zero standard. That has a really helpful hierarchy for selecting EPDs in it. So it's a framework decision map. Do you have an EPD related to that specific product in the site and location that the building is? If so, use that. If not, then and then it starts to tear down to using EPDs maybe in the same region but for a slightly different product, or EPDs from other in-country manufacturers, or generic EPDs in your region. So it goes down a tiering mechanism, which allows designers to say, I've followed this logical order and we're all systematically following that order. So the results that we come to should all have that reasonable level of dependability.
Thank you, Martin and Nigel. Before I move to the next question, Tina, I noticed one thing that caught my eye, and then Martin sort of connected to that as well. You mentioned provide guidance and support. I think you were mentioning that in reference perhaps also to our 145,000 global members, and bringing this kind of knowledge, skills, competencies to them also. While data is important, I think that's where this webinar really sits, but I think it's equally important to address the capacity building, skills, training, accreditation issues as well. I know you're very passionate about that. Would you mind sharing your views on what is being done and what more needs to be done to bring our members, folks who are at the forefront of assessments, um, for them, what are those things that we can do? You're on mute, Tina, sorry.
Again, I said with pleasure. I think the skills gap that we have, and Nigel touched on it as well. You know, the data, the calculations will only be as good as those who are carrying them out, if they're able to follow, even if we have an ideal global standard, which we do, and I'll talk about that. But we need to have skilled professionals that know how to deploy these tools and know where, you know, when Nigel's talking about the UK net zero building standard, that hierarchy of EPDs, well, someone has to know where to look, and they have to know how to choose which is most appropriate. So there's a lot of commitment and insider knowledge necessary to do these correctly. And something that we felt really important for RICS and for our membership, but even for beyond, is that we provide the training, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're providing, and that we also provide an end-to-end accreditation or certification process, so that the client who is ordering a whole life carbon assessment to be carried out on a project knows that the information that they're receiving has not only come from a data source which was appropriate and accurate, was carried out using a methodology which the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard, with a tool that has been value assured by RICS, because we no longer do these on spreadsheets, on Excel. This is all sort of mainly calculated in black boxes on systems that are cloud hosted. So we need to be sure that those systems are actually carrying this out properly. And then the final step is, well, the two main keys here are that the professional carrying out the standard actually is appropriately trained and accredited for carrying them out. And then finally, that it goes into a format which is comparable, measurable, and standardized. And so what we're doing, in addition to really looking at RICS being able to be at the source, being able to accredit and these steps, it's also about training the professionals. And so we have a series of whole life carbon assessment standard trainings, which go from the 2-hour webinar of just, what is a whole life carbon assessment standard? Why is it important? What do you need to know to get yourself started? All the way through to an 80-hour accredited program where you become an accredited carbon assessor in the whole life carbon assessment standard. And so this is really where I think, in addition to the guidance, and we have a number of guides that I'll talk about maybe at the next question, but we're really looking to support the profession in the wide sense of the word to be able to do this correctly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tina. So in a recent conversation, somebody sort of corrected me and said you use the word data pretty freely, because it's important also to understand the quality of data, because if you have bad data, then it's really not moving the needle ahead. So I think, Nigel, you had some views on what is the value and importance of quality data when we discuss near zero emission and resilient buildings.
Well, I think the quality of the data is incredibly important, actually, Anil, because we're in a world of data-driven decision making, and quality gives us the confidence to make informed design and investment decisions, and it drives innovation. And poor quality data can lead to, costly errors and misinformed strategies or damaged reputations. So, the data quality is very, very important. I was trying to, our clients are interested in the intersection of net zero carbon for net zero cost. So they're interested in carbon savings, and they understand the importance of carbon savings, but they're trying to understand how to manage the cost of that. And so they're obviously looking for the added value to the product. Also, many of our clients have made commitments through the SBTi initiative, and so they're reporting and measuring their emissions against reduction targets, and the building sector guidance now requires the inclusion of the building product reported within their scope 3 emissions. So, the accuracy of this is becoming increasingly more important. And there are a couple of examples that I can give of where there's some challenging situations around data accuracy and methodology. There's a recently celebrated case in the UK press, which is a prominent project here in the UK, which has been held up in planning for a number of years on challenges around, amongst other things, including the embodied carbon impact of a scheme compared with other alternatives. So making sure that the client can have trust in the data and understand the accuracy of the assessments and the advice and the alternatives that they've evaluated is really, really important, because something like these planning delays can be hugely costly to our investors, both in terms of delayed investment costs and legal costs. And another sort of interesting example is where we were working very, very closely with a developer who was particularly interested in driving down the embodied carbon of their proposed project, and we were grinding through all of the options really carefully, doing a really thorough step-by-step assessment of all the different alternatives, changing the grid, changing the structural materials, changing the mix of the structure, changing the height and the massing of the building, changing the facade and the building services systems, going through a really incrementalist approach to all of those things. And we managed to work towards what we thought was a still affordable, but yet the lowest reasonable, achievable target for that building. And having gained that confidence, only to have that questioned later on when another development in the same city started marketing itself as being between 20 and 30% more efficient than the design that we were at. So obviously that starts to create concern, and the client wants to understand why it's like that. And you have to dig into that data, and you have to dig into understanding how that data. And one of the things that emerged in that situation was that the other design was including things like all of the procurement gains that could be possible if you got all of the materials at the lowest possible carbon factors, regardless of whether that material was available at the time or regardless of the cost of that material 2 or 3 years down the line when the building would be in construction, and the demand of that lower carbon material would be much, much higher. So we had gone to a pre-procurement target saying that there could be some upside benefits if you then also choose your materials selectively. So these differences in approach and standards and what people are including and excluding when they talk about their projects, and they talk about, well, this is a 300 kilograms per square meter building or 600 kilograms per square meter building. What is included? How complete is that data? What is it based on? These things do matter. They impact investment choices, investment decisions, and so getting some standardization into this methodology is really, really important.
Thank you, Nigel. Tina, over to you, and I want to move to the next question in the interest of time. And perhaps after the second question, there are quite a few questions by the participants, which I will begin addressing. So to you, Tina, how can we ensure that the data shared across regions and sectors remains interoperable, comparable, and reliable, especially in the context of Chaillot Declaration's push for an open data protocol? Long question, but it's an important one.
I think the importance of it was illustrated by Nigel's example of two buildings in the same city being developed relatively along the same methodologies of construction, etc., and coming up with a very different response. Can you imagine if we then multiply that out across regions of the world, different countries that have entirely different modus operandi when it comes to construction, different materials, different inputs? You have to, if we want to meet our net zero goals, if we want to meet the Paris commitments for 1.5 degrees, if we want to meet what's been signed up to the Declaration de Chaillot, then we need a way of ensuring that everyone and every whole life carbon assessment standard is comparable and following along a similar and a comparable methodology. And that doesn't mean it's one size fits all. It doesn't mean that you have one single standard and one set of EPDs and everyone has to use the same. No, that would be the worst outcome possible. What it means is being able to be comparable. And so with our second edition, what RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment Standard does is it actually provides that framework. I like to compare this, and I often use this comparison, so excuse me for those that have already heard it, but I like to use the comparison of the accountancy world, where you have IFRS accounting, which sits above a number of local country accountancy standards, which are required for local compliance. But if you're a large corporate and you want to understand what's happening across the board in your businesses, then you need an accounting standard that actually draws up those data points in a comparable way so that you can see what the big picture is. This is what very similar is what the RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment Standard does. And how we do it is that we have also put forth a series of guides that accompany the use of the standard by clients, by practitioners. And one of them is the harmonization guideline. And the harmonization guideline actually looks at 7 major dimensions that allow that whole life carbon assessment standard to actually become harmonized and comparable. So I'm going to go through them really quickly. Now we can dig into it if there's any questions. But the first one is the actual whole life carbon assessment information modules. That means following the information modules and the module structure that's provided within the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard at the national level. The second point is to know when to carry out the assessment. You need to define the project phases when the assessment should be conducted. Then the third point is the third dimension is the assessment period. Clearly state the reference study period used for the assessment. Now, this all sounds like no-brainer, of course, but in reality, things like what Nigel was just talking about, one procurement is the ideal procurement procurement, everything goes, all the stars and moons are aligned. And then the other project is being realistic about, well, it's only the procurement of the materials that are available on the market at the time of the study. So these are really important. The fourth one is the spatial boundary. The spatial boundaries for assessment need to be aligned with the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard and local regulatory requirements or national guidance. And that means that they actually can be quite different from one country to the other. The fifth one are the asset elements. So using the elemental breakdown of assets that are contained within the standard. The sixth one is the data and the uncertainty. And we need to develop strategies to increase the availability and the quality of secondary data at the national level. So that was what Martin was talking about earlier. It's all about the EPDs and making sure that there's enough of them available and at the right level and at the quality that we need. And then I think I was on the sixth one. The second one is the reporting itself. And I was talking about that earlier. Using the reporting template, which is part of the RICS whole life carbon assessment standard, means that that template is actually going to fit in with the ICMS, which is the International Construction Management system, which actually allows you not only to compare what's comparable, but also to have the cost and the carbon in the same framework with the right buildup of the framework. So I hope that that gives a vision of how we harmonize within RICS whole life carbon assessment standard, how we can really harmonize that so that we can actually meet our goals. The climate knows no boundaries. Climate change and carbon cross boundaries, and we cannot use different methods, different standards, different reporting formats, different inputs in not comparable, and hope to be able to measure to improve. And we don't get the trust we need. And I think that's something that, you know, Nigel touched on as well, and Martin as well. It suffice to have one project with two teams that come up with two different numbers of carbon per kilograms of carbon per square meter, and all of a sudden the client or the instructor, if it comes to a permit, has no idea if they can believe one or the other, because it's just not, it's not clear. So this is the importance, I think, of harmonization. Hopefully that answered the question, Anil.
It clearly did, because we got some applauses, virtual applauses for your response. So excellent. I think what I want to do is jump into some participant questions. Martin, this one, maybe I'll put you on the spot. Pinaki has asked, have you developed data checklist or template if one desires to conduct a carbon assessment for whole life buildings? So it's more to do with checklists and templates. What are the standards followed for embodied carbon? It's a long question, so I'm going to stop there. So address this issue of checklists and templates to ease the collection of data, and then standards for embodied carbon.
Yes, thank you. So maybe to clarify again, the open BDF, the format that I talked about before, and the work of the Global Building Data Initiative in general is not focused on one particular methodology for the assessment. So what we do is really to respond to what Tina put out there, namely that we need comparability across different assessments, across different methods. So I think for people who are just getting started, I think there are great resources available through the RICS whole life carbon assessment methodology. For those working in the European context, I think there are really important resources from the European Commission around the levels framework, which also spells out the details of reporting results per building element for different life cycle stages, as well as also reporting on material quantities. And that is some point that I would like to emphasize again, building on what Tina already said. When it comes to making these assessments comparable, yes, it's about the methods, and yes, it's about understanding the results in detail, but a key issue is really to understand the primary data, so to understand the material quantities, the energy demand, the energy use considered in those assessments. And it's really critical to enable this level of transparency and comparability, especially when we talk about clients assessing different design options, and also policymakers and administrators needing to compare building design submissions also against regulatory standards. So this level of transparency is really something that we want to emphasize and also want to enable with our work around the open building data format. And if I may, I also saw another question in the chat earlier that was asking, because we talk a lot about carbon, we talk a lot about whole life carbon. And while that is the center of the debate and a really important perspective, of course, there is a broader life cycle assessment scope, which also includes other environmental indicators. And as for the work that we're doing with the GBDI and the OpenBDF, we have a full set of indicators currently aligned with the European EN 15804 plus A2 standard. So that covers different types of carbon, including biogenic carbon, fossil carbon, and so on, as well as the long list of environmental indicators, all of which can be reported using that logic. And the attributes and the set of attributes can also be extended for other use cases to, for example, include indicators for circularity or include cost-related indicators also in the formatting.
Thank you very much, Martin. There's a question on, is there comparison of building certifications, LEED, neighbor, SBTi, in terms of actual reflecting building emissions? I think Roland has shared to that question already a link, which I think provides sufficient information there. So I'm not going to go there. My third question, in fact, which is part of a comment which we already see in our chat, is what happens next, right? So we all have admired the problem for a long time. We all know the importance of data, but as a sort of your closing statements also, broad brush, what do you like to see happen? If you had that magic wand, what would you do to move the needle forward? I will maybe start with Tina, if I can put you on the spot there.
Thanks, Anil. I think I'm going to come back to, I forget if it was, I think it was Martin that said it earlier. I'm going to come back to regulation. I think that the silver bullet is to have a requirement for whole life carbon assessments to be carried out as a regulatory requirement. And then the next silver bullet is to be setting thresholds which need to be met at national level. I think that would go a huge way to allowing our sector to start being a force for good when it comes to the work that we're undertaking. Oh, you're on mute, Anil.
Sorry. So Martin and then Nigel.
Yes, thank you. What's next? So again, doubling down on the aspect of and the importance of regulation, I think that's really a key aspect here to drive demand also from the industry side and also to really facilitate this process of building capacity on the industry side. At the same time, we also need to build capacity on both the industry side as well as the policy side. And we've made very good experience with a project framework that we've developed in the European context called Indicate. I will publish in the chat in a second, where we really combine a multidisciplinary team from academia, from industry representation, from society, and also partner with policymakers to support national teams through co-funding and really through mentoring and guidance as they develop their own capacities to conduct whole life carbon assessments, to benchmark whole life carbon in their respective regions and develop targets from that to inform whole life carbon legislation. So I think such models also of scaling capacity building globally are really important and really needed to really facilitate and enable the speed of implementation that we would love to see.
Nigel?
Thank you, Martin. Well, so I would say, whilst I completely support regulation being an absolutely necessary lever for change, I think that there is so much that the industry can do to de-risk and to make regulation something that is easier to adopt. And I think the UK Net Zero standard is a great example of an amazing collaborative, there are over a dozen organisations that have led on this, with hundreds of practitioners involved in developing a detailed methodology for the assessment of whole life carbon and the benchmarking targets for a net zero building, and the road testing of that standard is the sort of thing that can give national governments the confidence to bring language in to say there is a methodology, there is a pathway, industry can do this, it has the capabilities to do it, and so it can introduce that regulation in that way. So I think, I'm also drawn to a piece of work that we've been collaborating on recently with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and Autodesk, working with 6 other consultants, AECOM, Arcadis, Ramboll, Foster & Partners, SOM, and ourselves, Arup, in a really close collaborative examination of take a BIM model. Everyone takes the same BIM model. Everyone describes to one another how each firm approaches the materials takeoffs from that BIM model, how it approaches embodied carbon factors, and then how it's going to work towards a whole life carbon assessment and ultimately the whole life carbon assessment. And that has been an incredibly revealing exercise. There's a white paper expected on that from World Business Council for Sustainable Development and Autodesk imminently during October. And it speaks very clearly to those organizations using best endeavors, the differences that yet exist in how consultants approach whole life carbon assessments. And it's fine for us to have different ways of doing things, but we have to have confidence in the accuracy and the comparability of the outcomes. And so working together, industries working together under trust frameworks, I think is going to be a really important way of us accelerating, sharing what we're all trying to do to get ahead of this wave, and to develop capability to decarbonize the built environment.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nigel. That was very good. We are pretty close to concluding here. Wanted to make a couple of comments. Does what we are discussing here extend globally, especially to environmental data? Yes, it does. In fact, our ICS is going to be releasing soon national guidelines for preparing secondary data, environmental data guidelines. So essentially at the national level, what can you do to improve the availability of background data for assessments? What strategies can we use to calculate LCAs? This is actually a very important question. In regions where you have limited EPDs, limited low carbon materials, as Nigel was mentioning, I think it's crucial that that aspect be addressed also. If I'm an assessor sitting in a country where we do not have much data available, what do we do? I think our standard does provide some guidance. I'm really delighted to see the work, Nigel, you're doing with Autodesk and others. I've written to Autodesk to see how we can input into the WLCA and BIM model connection. Perhaps IFC's Building Smart can also play a role there. Still lots and lots of questions and comments. Maybe, Mona, I will bring you back here to conclude the session. But before I do that, I want to thank GlobalABC on behalf of our ICS and our members and our expert panel members here, but more importantly, the participants who really joined. Maybe, Mona, if you can also download and we can get access to the meeting chat and the questions. Perhaps we can do a follow-up. I could volunteer my panel members here. I could take the lead and we can come up with some sort of a response and share that in a blog or an article. Over to you, Mona.
Thank you, Anil. Indeed, it's been quite a nice webinar, and it's really lovely to see all the interactions on the chat. And it was making me think about a follow-up, maybe even a part 2 webinar to dig more into the data. I see quite a lot of questions that are focused on actions and next steps and strategies we can use to calculate LCAs for regions with limited data. So I think these are all really interesting questions that we definitely need to be delving some more into. So thank you, Anil, for putting this together. Thanks to all our panelists, Tina, Nigel, and Martin, for your time and all the time you spent in preparation as well. And thanks to everybody who's participated. If this is a topic of interest to you, please reach out to the panelists as well as to the GlobalABC. We're happy to include you in our Materials Hub mailing list, as well as engage with you on the different activities that you're doing. And this is the first webinar in this series in the Materials Hub, so we do look forward to suggestions on what you might want to hear in upcoming webinars, as well as what you might want to contribute to upcoming webinars. So please feel free to reach out, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.